So increasingly in my coaching work and my vision builder work, I am asked about my own career journey. I guess because I did make that pivot from the world of professional and financial services to an independent entrepreneurial career. And I seem to be working with a lot of individuals on the vision builder who are currently flying in their professional or financial services roles or their corporate roles. And they envision something a little bit more autonomous, maybe with some of that entrepreneurial excitement and independence in the next decade. So over this week and maybe some of next week, you're going to hear a series of conversations that I had with Kate where I was being interviewed for her podcast. And especially for those of you who are newer to this show, and we've had a lot of new listeners in 2024, this will give you a bit of a sense of my career journey, some of those pivotal moments. And people often want to know this, that it wasn't all straightforward. There were some tricky conversations. There were some moments. And I'm also going to talk through the specific work that I do and who I work with and what it's like to work with me. So especially in this first episode, you'll get a sense of what my work looks like today and how I got here. Enjoy.
Welcome back. My guest today is Maya Gudka, who is actually quite a good friend and a buddy. But yeah, she's smiling away. And I'm so pleased that she's here to talk with you because she is one of my gurus for executive coaching. So I let you say hello.
Hi, Kate. I mean, to be one of your gurus in any dimension, I'm pleased. Even if it's a small box, I don't care.
It's not that small. And it's really fun. Maya and I first met, which is this story, and I've been on your podcast. This is the first time you've been on mine, and we've been hunting for a while. So I'm really glad that you're finally here. When you were doing your master's, you were writing a dissertation of a systematic review, particular type of research. There wasn't many examples of it. You read, this is the backstory, isn't it? You read mine, which was the university had put as an exemplar. I don't win prizes. I don't win awards. I don't do well in things. That dissertation of mine I aced it. Anyway, so you read this and you systematically hunted me down and pestered me and said, would I support you, coach you through doing your dissertation? And that was where I got to know you as the most tenacious, fastest thinking, brightest person that I had met in a very long time. And I'm just so happy that we've continued that connection right from that time.
Yeah, we haven't met in person. And when we do, I think you're just going to get a shock because you could like tower over me.
Yeah, I think you're only we, aren't you?
Yeah.
So can you introduce a bit more about, like I said, executive coach, but even that is already kind of a strange thing, isn't it? Because like, what does that mean?
Yeah. So I break executive coaching down into two dimensions. One is leadership coaching and the other one is career coaching. So any person that I'm coaching tends to experience a mixture of both from me. If you're interested in the question of like, what is executive, what is leader? I did some research and we did kind of use those two terms interchangeably. We used executive and leader interchangeably. So I don't think we need to break it down that much further. They're at a certain level inside knowledge work. They might have managerial responsibilities, have people reporting to them. But, I do coach some individual contributors as well, who doesn't mean that they're doing any less significant work. It just happens that their line of work requires individual contribution and values that. So that's just an academic point. But let me just talk about what I actually do. So I do those two types of coaching, leadership and career coaching with individuals. And I do it across a really wide spectrum. So on one end, I have my charity Frontline, where I coach at any one time, I'm coaching about 5 to 7 social workers, which has been such a cool experience for the last year or so. And I would say in that issues around discrimination and stuff come up that little bit more. Like there is a lot to do with racial differences and things like that comes up. The second bucket is my business school. And that is just this sort of portal into another type of diversity. So I coach there, starting from people who've never worked yet. So they're literally doing their masters and they haven't actually gotten their feet wet in a job, all the way up to their senior executive programs, kind of C-suite programs and things like that, where they'll say, we have this sort of really sturdy group of coaches that have been through all of it. we wouldn't otherwise wheel them out unless they were fit. So it's that kind of full spectrum of experience.
And who's that with?
That's at London Business School.
That's
at London Business School.
Yeah.
And the beauty there is that not only is it that range of experience from literally haven't worked a day in my life to, you know, at the very other end of my career, they are super international. So America, Europe, Asia. I've coached a lot of Chinese people now, a lot of Middle Eastern men. Like it's just so diverse in that way. And then industry, it's like all industries, gaming, healthcare, government, it's just super diverse. So what I love about working with London Business School is just those different types of diversity. And then the final category is what you probably call like the high-end corporate stuff, where I'm working with one-to-one or newly formed senior leadership teams. And these are people who are often commanding or leading large teams already, and they are on some sort of a pathway to C-suite. And I'll go into their offices, work one-to-one. Some of that will be virtual. Some of that will be in group settings. So yeah, that's the kind of array. I do have a bit of a financial services sort of focus because that was my first career, but I think there's plenty of diversity in there as well.
Whoa, I love it. You see, this is the cool thing, everybody, about when you run your podcast, if anybody's ever inspired to do that, is you get to invite all sorts of cool people on and have conversations that you wouldn't really get the space to have otherwise. So even though I've known you all this time, I've never actually asked you that direct question. Yeah. And I just love your answer. I love the color and variety and spice of our lives, but of your life. That's so cool. So what kind of pathway, like your background, just tell us a little bit about that. What led you into who you are today?
Yeah. Well, I always say, you know, it wasn't like I was this overworked person that burnt out and then saw the light and was lying on somebody's couch and had this big epiphany. Like that wasn't me. I was always just fascinated by self-development. It would be like I'd go into the bookshop and I'd go straight to that section and I would just have to read everything. I introduced my parents. My parents introduced me to Stephen Covey. It was like lying around the house when I was very young. So like when I was 7, it was just there. But then I started finding books and then trying to indoctrinate them on these books like Susan Jeffers' Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. I was like distributing this to my family. So I just had this interest that was there. Family gatherings, there'd be like the group of men. So this was like sort of an Indian family gathering. I didn't come from a particularly traditional family, but you would have this division that would go on where you'd have the ladies there and then you'd have the men, right? And they'd be talking business. And I would always be sitting with the men talking business, trying to make sure that I understood the whole conversation and chipping in wherever I felt I could. I always had this desire to be in the conversation, have a seat at whichever table. And I was finding ways to sort of do this versions of self-development and give advice to the only person I really could, which was my younger brother, who wasn't really that interested in it. But, you know, so then I was like, listen, I need to find a way to actually professionalize giving it real advice, right? So when I discovered coaching later on, I was like, this is so cool. I get to gently advise and help people find their way and sometimes give advice, but in a way that actually works and that people aren't going to go. But anyway, so I always had this interest, and it wasn't until I was at KPMG where I became a young manager and I got access to all of this development stuff, like basically the equivalent of life coaching, but it was all happening inside an organization. And I was like, this is incredible. They had a really great provision. They had brilliant coaches, and I got all this coaching, and I was like, this stuff exists in a professional context. And I feel like the idea of life coaching was just about around. And I remember talking to my dad. Bless my dad, was a real kind of role model for me growing up. I wanted to study the same degree at the same university as him and, you know, follow in his footsteps, be an economist. And at some point I just had to sort of depart from that, because he was kind of like, look, Maya, you're in this great job at KPMG. You know, you don't know how lucky you are. And I was sitting on the sofa going, yeah, but I want to be a life coach. That's what I want to be. And he was like, it's not possible. And so it was like this moment of thinking, okay. And I remember shed some tears. This is a little bit wordy, but I was organizing my wedding at the time. And I think he was shocked at how I managed to bring this thing together, my efficiency, my speed, because I think he thought I was a little bit, shall we say, lazy at work? I think I wasn't really giving it my all. And so I think it was this thing. He was like, look, you're so capable. You're so capable. You just aim high. I was like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. I want to be a life coach. He was like, it doesn't exist. Anyway, so that was my sort of frictiony moment. And I then sort of I would call it like, maybe I did it the sort of the cautious Indian way, where I just wiggled my way into leadership development and talent management, but I didn't do anything.
That's such a good word. We don't use the word wiggle enough. What was your first degree?
Economics.
Right. So you did do economics.
Yeah.
And then did you do a master's at that? Like, I remember at some point everybody began to do immediately masters, but
and I didn't. No. I was just like, I need to not study anymore. I need to do some real work. And and
you got the job at KPMG.
I went straight from uni into Goldman Sachs, and it was like a pretty high octane environment. I mean, it was great, but it was just like the hours were punishing, and I'd pick the one with the best hours and they were still punishing. I still had to be at my desk at 6 a.m. every day. I had a boss that was she was a bit of a bully. And she used to sit down next to me, and I would literally, you could feel like your whole body just seizing up, and just like that was when the tension began, kind of thing. And now obviously I thank her, because I basically had to run away from that job as quickly as possible. Whereas if I'd maybe had a nicer boss, I feel like I would have stuck around in a kind of comfortable environment. Instead, I kind of jumped ship. I was like, let me get closer to economics. I did still love my economics. So jumped into that at PwC, and then was opportunistic. So a director took me with him to start the team at KPMG, the economics team. Got to be part of this massively fast growing team. We grew it from like 2 people to like 150. This is why I then became this very young manager and got access to all this stuff a lot younger maybe than one might. So I was like 25 and getting leadership coaching, getting personal one-to-one stuff. And that's when I was like, oh, this is happening.
Wow. I did not know any of that about you. So that's very, very cool. Wow. So it sounds all very high octane and exciting and thrilling. And even though it had the word economist in there as well, it's like, what made it so exciting?
I always found intrinsic joy in anything I was learning in, right? So the degree was really interesting because you get to learn loads. Goldman's was interesting because we're in New York for a month. Then we come back and, you're dipping your toe in the water. I think economics, and then finding an environment where I could actually practice almost like an academic, but for clients, it was cool. Like these places, I think they really rewarded and supported like talent. They wanted us to feel stimulated. They gave us, it'd be like going off to the Bahamas, like just me and another girl, maybe younger than me. And we'd be running like the transformation of their telco system. Like fun stuff was happening. I was a consultant. We were getting out. I went and lived in Guernsey for 3 months. Like, I don't know, there was travel, lots of like-minded people, a good energy. Being an economist, I think if you're doing the right kind of work is brilliant. Like we were involved in disputes with lawyers, and their case would hinge off the numbers that we would come up with. So I really enjoyed that kind of case making, and it's still like a foundation for me now, the ability to sort of build a case that is not just based on like accounting numbers, that is built on how do you quantify things? How do you quantify things that people might not otherwise quantify? How do you find clever ways to do that? It was such a way to continue some sort of intellectual curiosity into the working world. I mean, that's why people love consulting, right? They get to use their brains. And I really enjoyed that until I didn't.
Well, I think I get the whole how come it didn't really float your boat anymore. But what I was hearing and what you're saying is your natural geekery in you about how much you love quantifying unquantifiable things and finding a way to quantify them. And for me, so there's a question rather than me jumping to my own conclusion, but like, is that the connection to positive psychology? Like, how do we quantify the unknown? How do you know if you've helped someone as a life coach? How do you know if you've achieved anything? Like, this whole world that we move in is ostensibly quite fluffy.
100%. Economics for me is like the big picture psychology, right? You have to be able to fit and understand human behavior, but in a macro sense. Right? Mm-hmm. The concept of utility, the concept of opportunity cost. There are so many life concepts in economics that the concepts around investment, supply and demand, like different curves. Honestly, there is so much cool stuff in there. That's the big picture. That has stood me in such good stead as a coach, because when you've studied economics to a certain level, you feel like anyone can present you with their challenges. And it's actually been really important for me because obviously I showed up as a coach, an executive coach at like the age of 30, coaching people 20 years older than me, but also surrounded by other coaches that were 20 years older than me. Right. And I was wheeled out, put in front of clients because they knew that if they needed to talk to me about business, they could, because I had that sort of broad ability. I've also done consulting, so I did know how to take things apart. But for me, that structure is always there. I'm never afraid to ask the silly questions because I'm like, I get the fundamentals of how this stuff is all meant to work. Now, my intrinsic interest is not in that. So there was this thing my dad would say to me, like, read the newspapers, Maya. Like, you should read the newspaper. I was like, I'm just not really that interested in like the newspapers. Like, I want to read Psychology's magazine if I'm going to read something. Like, I want to read about how people work inside these places. So that was where I was like finding my direction. But I just feel those fundamental principles have stood me in really good stead. So I see that as the macro, and then I see these positive psychology and cognitive psychology as that bottom up, that real. Then how do you understand at an individual level how that stuff is happening?
Wow, that is so cool. Also making me think about, in a different way, about my own military training, is this ability to think at strategic level, to grasp a big picture, to see something in its multi dimensions without very much time or space.
Yeah.
And never any money. Well, in the case of the army, never any money to pay for it, and taking the human factor through that of like, well, what needs done now, and who's going to do it. And now there isn't the time to be producing a really slick plan in 6 months. We need to do it now. I hadn't seen that connection. Wow, that's really cool.
So one of my personal missions is to get each and every one of you started towards designing that life of your dreams and taking those first important steps in the direction of your 10-year vision. And so if you've been listening to recent episodes and feel like you do want to get started on this journey, but maybe you've got some ifs and buts, something's holding you back, I've got a really short quiz that might help you identify what's holding you back so that we can address it and hopefully get you started. So if that is of interest to you, just drop me a message on LinkedIn. I'm Maya Goodker there, or send me an email at info@mayagoodker.com and I will send you a link to that quiz. Look forward to connecting with you next time. Bye-bye.